The day I lost my favorite fishing spot was the day I discovered I owned half the neighborhood. When Margaret Whitmore, our HOA president, slapped me with a $500 fine for trespassing on private waterfront property, she had no idea she was about to learn the most expensive lesson of her life. What she didn't know would cost her everything she thought she owned. Before we dive into how I turned the tables on the most powerful woman in Lakeside Estates, drop a comment below and tell me what you would have done in my situation, because trust me, you're going to want to hear how this plays out. I never planned to become a property mogul at 62. My name is Sarah Chen, and for the past 15 years, I've lived quietly in Lakeside Estates, a pristine planned community in Northern Virginia where the grass stays emerald green and the property values climb higher every year. I moved here after my divorce, using most of my settlement to buy a modest 2-bedroom ranch on Elm Street. It wasn't the biggest house or the fanciest, but it had something I treasured more than granite countertops or a 3-car garage. It backed up to Miller's Pond. That pond saved my sanity during the darkest period of my life. When my 28-year marriage imploded and I found myself starting over in my late 40s, I discovered that casting a line into those calm waters could quiet the chaos in my mind. I'd wake up at dawn, grab my coffee and tackle box, and spend 2 hours watching the sunrise paint the water gold while bass and bluegill tested my patience. Fishing became my meditation, my therapy, and my connection to something larger than my personal disasters. My background made me an unlikely candidate for neighborhood drama. I spent 30 years as a corporate paralegal, specializing in real estate law and property disputes. I knew contracts, deeds, and zoning regulations better than most attorneys. But after the divorce, I deliberately chose a quiet life. I wanted to tend my garden, perfect my fly fishing technique, and maybe volunteer at the local library. I had no interest in HOA politics or neighborhood power struggles. I just wanted peace. The community seemed perfect for that goal. Lakeside Estates marketed itself as a haven for professionals and retirees who appreciated well-maintained common areas and reasonable rules. The HOA fees were steep, $200 monthly, but they covered landscaping, snow removal, and maintenance of the walking trails that wound around Miller's Pond. The pond itself was listed in all the marketing materials as a community amenity, complete with a small dock and designated fishing areas. I felt like I'd found my retirement paradise. For my first decade here, everything ran smoothly. The original HOA board consisted of reasonable people who understood that rules should serve residents, not control them. They approved my request to install a small garden shed, didn't hassle me about my modest vegetable garden, and even complimented my landscaping during their annual property inspections. I attended the monthly meetings sporadically, mostly to stay informed about community maintenance projects and budget discussions. It was boring, civilized, and exactly what I wanted. The trouble started 3 years ago when Margaret Whitmore moved into the largest house on Maple Drive, a sprawling colonial that sat on nearly an acre with prime waterfront access. Margaret wasn't just wealthy, she was aggressively wealthy, the kind of person who mentioned the price of everything and the value of nothing. She'd made her fortune in commercial real estate development, which meant she knew how to acquire property and eliminate obstacles. Within 6 months of moving in, she'd orchestrated a hostile takeover of the HOA board. Margaret's campaign was masterful in its manipulative efficiency. She identified every minor neighborhood annoyance: dogs barking past 9 p.m., holiday decorations staying up too long, mailboxes that needed repainting, and convinced residents that these problems required strong leadership to solve. She positioned herself as the candidate who would restore property values and community standards. She won the HOA presidency in a landslide, bringing 2 loyal allies onto the board with her. The changes started immediately. Margaret tripled the number of community rules, instituted weekly property inspections, and began issuing fines for violations that would have earned gentle reminders under the old board. She banned clotheslines, restricted garden decorations, and required advance approval for any exterior modifications, including changing your front door color. The monthly HOA meetings transformed from casual discussions into formal proceedings where Margaret wielded her gavel like a weapon and residents sat in nervous silence. But Margaret's real obsession was the waterfront. She believed that property owners who paid premium prices for lakefront homes deserved exclusive access to the best fishing spots and dock space. She started restricting pond access, claiming that overcrowding was damaging the delicate ecosystem. She installed reserved parking signs at the most convenient access points and posted new rules about fishing licenses, equipment storage, and quiet hours. Every change seemed designed to discourage casual fishing and favor serious anglers who could afford expensive gear and knew how to navigate bureaucratic obstacles. I watched these developments with growing unease, but I didn't speak up. My fishing routine hadn't been disrupted yet, and I'd learned through my divorce that sometimes the smartest strategy is keeping your head down until the storm passes. I figured Margaret would eventually find other targets for her control issues and leave the fishing situation alone. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was underestimating how personal Margaret's vendetta could become. She'd noticed me during her morning power walks, watching me cast my line from what she considered the premium fishing spot on the pond's north shore. This area offered the best combination of deep water, natural cover, and convenient access from the main trail. I'd been fishing there for over a decade, arriving early to avoid crowds and always cleaning up after myself. But in Margaret's mind, I was a problem that needed solving. The confrontation began on a Tuesday morning in late September. I'd been having a particularly successful morning. The bass were active in the cooler weather, and I'd already caught and released 3 nice fish. I was enjoying the peaceful rhythm of casting and retrieving when I heard the sharp click of expensive heels on the wooden dock behind me. "Excuse me, Ms. Chen." Margaret's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "I need to speak with you about your fishing activities." I turned to find Margaret standing with her arms crossed, wearing a crisp business suit despite the early hour. She held a clipboard and wore the expression of a principal confronting a troublesome student. Even at 7 a.m., she looked like she was heading into a boardroom battle. Margaret informed me that I was fishing in a restricted area. According to her interpretation of the community rules, the North Shore fishing spot was reserved for waterfront property owners only during prime fishing hours. Since my house was 3 streets back from the pond, I was technically trespassing on community amenities that I hadn't paid premium prices to access. I tried to reason with her. I pointed out that I'd been fishing in this spot for over a decade without any complaints. The community marketing materials specifically advertised pond fishing as an amenity available to all residents. I paid my HOA fees faithfully and had never caused any problems or conflicts with other residents. Couldn't we work out some kind of compromise? Margaret's response was swift and dismissive. The old board had been too permissive, she explained, failing to enforce reasonable boundaries that protected everyone's property investments. The new rules weren't personal. They were business decisions designed to preserve the character and value of lakeside estates. If I wanted premium fishing access, I should have bought premium property. Since I hadn't, I needed to use the designated general access areas like everyone else. She handed me a formal written warning, complete with rule citations and her official signature. The document informed me that continued fishing in restricted areas would result in escalating fines, beginning with $100 for the first violation and doubling with each subsequent offense. Repeat violators faced potential legal action and possible suspension of community amenities. I stared at the paper, feeling a familiar knot form in my stomach. This was exactly the kind of bureaucratic bullying I'd hoped to escape by moving to a quiet community. Margaret's smile as she waited for my response was the same satisfied smirk I'd seen on my ex-husband's face when he thought he'd won an argument through sheer intimidation. But I wasn't the same woman who'd been pushed around during my divorce. I'd learned to pick my battles carefully and document everything. I thanked Margaret politely for the information, folded the warning into my tackle box, and began packing up my fishing gear. I wasn't retreating. I was regrouping. Over the next few weeks, I tried to adapt to Margaret's new restrictions. I arrived earlier to claim spots in the general access areas before they filled up with other displaced fishermen. I researched the exact boundaries of the restricted zones and carefully positioned myself just outside the arbitrary lines Margaret had drawn. I even attended an HOA meeting to formally request clarification about the fishing rules and suggest a rotating schedule that would give all residents fair access to prime spots. Margaret rejected every compromise I proposed. During the HOA meeting, she delivered a patronizing lecture about property rights and community standards, while other board members nodded in agreement. She insisted that the restrictions were necessary to prevent overcrowding and environmental damage to the pond's delicate ecosystem. When I pointed out that the pond was artificial and regularly stocked with fish specifically for recreational angling, she dismissed my concerns as irrelevant. The situation escalated when Margaret expanded her interpretation of the rules. She decided that the walking trail along the pond's north shore was also restricted during prime fishing hours, meaning I couldn't even access my second-choice fishing spots without potentially violating her boundaries. She installed additional signage and began conducting personal patrols, appearing whenever I tried to fish and making pointed comments about rule compliance and community standards. The psychological pressure was deliberate and effective. Margaret had turned my peaceful morning ritual into a source of stress and conflict. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, second-guessing whether my chosen fishing spot might trigger another confrontation. The joy I'd found in those quiet dawn hours began to evaporate under the weight of her constant surveillance and criticism. But Margaret's biggest mistake was making our conflict personal. During one particularly unpleasant encounter, she suggested that I might be happier in a different community where the standards weren't quite so high. Her implication was clear. I didn't belong in lakeside estates because I couldn't afford waterfront property and didn't understand how upscale communities operated. That comment hit me exactly where Margaret intended it to hurt. I'd already been forced to rebuild my life once after my divorce. I'd worked hard to establish roots in this community and create a sense of belonging after decades of feeling like an outsider in my own marriage. The idea of being pushed out again, this time by a neighborhood bully with delusions of aristocracy, sparked something dangerous in my chest. I started paying closer attention to Margaret's HOA meetings and the legal documents she circulated to justify her expanding list of restrictions. My paralegal background gave me insights that other residents lacked. I noticed discrepancies between the community's original covenants and Margaret's creative interpretations of property rights. Some of her most aggressive rules seemed to exceed her actual authority as HOA president. But I also noticed something else. Margaret's confidence about property boundaries seemed to be based more on assumption than research. She spoke about waterfront property rights and exclusive access zones with great authority, but I'd never seen any surveys or legal documents that definitively established where community property ended and private property began. Given the age of the development and the complexity of the original land transfers, I suspected the actual boundaries might be more complicated than anyone realized. The breaking point came on a cold November morning when I was fishing from the community dock, clearly public property that even Margaret couldn't claim as restricted. I'd been there for over an hour, enjoying one of the last warm days before winter, when Margaret appeared with two men I didn't recognize. She introduced them as her property consultants and announced that they were conducting a boundary survey to resolve ongoing disputes about pond access. The men began setting up surveying equipment while Margaret explained that she'd commissioned this survey to establish definitive property lines and eliminate any confusion about fishing rights. She was tired of dealing with residents who couldn't understand basic property law, and this survey would provide documentation that even the most stubborn rule breakers couldn't argue with. I watched the surveyors work while Margaret provided commentary about property values and community standards. She was clearly enjoying this moment, convinced that official documentation would finally give her the ammunition she needed to ban me from my favorite fishing spots permanently. Her smugness was so thick I could practically taste it. But as the morning progressed, I noticed the surveyors exchanging concerned glances and double-checking their measurements. One of them asked Margaret several pointed questions about the original property transfers and whether she had copies of the deed restrictions that established the HOA's authority over the pond area. Margaret's answers became increasingly vague and defensive. When the lead surveyor asked to see the legal description for my property deed, I agreed immediately. I'd reviewed those documents many times during my home purchase, but I'd never compared them carefully to the community's master plan or the original land surveys. As the surveyor studied my deed and cross-referenced it with his measurements, his expression shifted from confusion to amazement. After nearly 3 hours of careful measurement and legal document review, the surveyor delivered news that changed everything. The property boundaries in Lakeside Estates had been incorrectly interpreted for over 20 years. The original land developer had divided the area using a complex system of easements and shared ownership that created overlapping property rights. Most residents, including Margaret, had never bothered to trace their property lines to the original surveys. The shocking discovery was that my modest house on Elm Street came with property rights that extended far beyond my backyard fence. According to the original deed and land survey, I owned a significant portion of the pond itself, plus most of the North Shore area that Margaret had declared off-limits. The premium waterfront property that justified her exclusive fishing rules was actually part of my legal property boundaries. Margaret's mansion, despite its impressive size and expensive location, sat entirely on a landlocked parcel that included no water rights whatsoever. The previous owners had purchased their properties based on incorrect assumptions about boundary lines, and the HOA had been operating under those same false assumptions for decades. Margaret had been restricting my access to my own property while claiming ownership rights she'd never legally possessed. The surveyors confirmed that Margaret's house, her landscaped backyard, and even her private dock had been built partially on property that belonged to me. The easement agreements that allowed her water access were conditional and revocable, meaning I had the legal right to restrict her pond privileges the same way she'd been restricting mine. Margaret's reaction to this revelation was spectacular. She went through denial, anger, and bargaining in the space of about 10 minutes, finally settling on a desperate attempt to discredit the survey results. She demanded to see additional documentation, questioned the surveyor's credentials, and threatened legal action if they were spreading false information about established property rights. But the evidence was undeniable. The surveyors had cross-referenced multiple sources, including the original developer's plats, county records, and individual property deeds. The legal description in my deed specifically included riparian rights to Miller's Pond and associated waterfront access, language that had been overlooked by decades of real estate agents, title companies, and property owners. I thanked the surveyors professionally, collected copies of their findings, and headed home to plan my next move. Margaret had spent months making my life miserable based on property rights she didn't actually possess. Now it was time for her to learn what real property ownership looked like. My first step was hiring a real estate attorney to confirm the survey results and explore my legal options. The attorney, Patricia Wells, had 20 years of experience with property disputes and HOA conflicts. She reviewed my documentation with the enthusiasm of a treasure hunter who just found gold. Patricia confirmed that I owned approximately 40% of Miller's Pond, plus the most desirable fishing areas along the north and east shores. My property rights were bulletproof, backed by original deeds that predated the HOA's existence. Margaret's attempts to restrict my access weren't just wrong, they were legally actionable harassment that had interfered with my property rights for months. But the really interesting discovery was that Margaret's dock, landscaping, and waterfront amenities were built on my property without any legal permission or easement agreements. I had multiple options for addressing these violations, ranging from demanding immediate removal to negotiating compensation for unauthorized use of my land. Patricia also identified a bigger problem for Margaret and several other waterfront property owners. The original land development had been structured to give pond access to multiple property owners while maintaining shared responsibility for maintenance and environmental protection. Margaret's attempts to create exclusive access zones violated not just my property rights, but the original community covenants that all residents had agreed to follow. The HOA itself was potentially liable for allowing and enforcing Margaret's illegal restrictions. By supporting her false claims about property boundaries, they participated in violating my rights and potentially damaged the property values of other residents who'd been denied proper pond access. I spent the next 2 weeks researching every aspect of Margaret's HOA presidency and her previous real estate dealings. My paralegal skills came in handy as I traced property transfers, reviewed meeting minutes, and analyzed the legal authority behind every rule and restriction she'd implemented. What I discovered was a pattern of overreach that extended far beyond the fishing restrictions. Margaret had been interpreting her HOA authority in ways that benefited her personal interests while imposing costs and restrictions on other residents. She'd approved expensive landscaping projects that primarily benefited waterfront properties, shifted maintenance costs away from premium homes, and created rules that effectively reduced property values for anyone who didn't live in the most expensive areas. I also learned that Margaret's background in commercial real estate development included several deals that had been investigated for fraudulent property transfers and boundary disputes. She had a history of aggressive tactics and creative interpretations of property law that had generated complaints and lawsuits in her previous projects. Armed with this information, I was ready to implement my revenge plan. But I wanted to give Margaret one final opportunity to resolve our conflict reasonably before I played my strongest cards. I requested a private meeting with Margaret to discuss our ongoing disagreement about pond access. I suggested that we might be able to find a compromise that would satisfy both of our concerns without involving expensive legal procedures or community-wide conflict. Margaret agreed to meet, probably expecting another opportunity to lecture me about property law and community standards. We met at the community clubhouse on a Wednesday evening, with Margaret bringing her standard clipboard and condescending attitude. I began by acknowledging that property boundaries in older developments could be complicated and that reasonable people might interpret deed language differently. I presented the survey results as new information that clarified some previous confusion rather than evidence of wrongdoing on anyone's part. Margaret's response was predictably arrogant. She dismissed the survey as irrelevant, claimed that established usage patterns trumped technical deed language, and insisted that her understanding of property law was more sophisticated than mine. She offered to allow me continued access to general fishing areas if I agreed to stop challenging her authority and acknowledged her property rights to the premium waterfront zones. That was exactly the response I'd hoped for. Margaret had just rejected a reasonable settlement offer while reaffirming her false claims about property ownership. She'd also created a clear record of her refusal to respect legitimate property rights, which would be useful if the situation escalated to litigation. I thanked Margaret for her time and left the meeting without revealing my full legal position. I wanted her to remain confident and unprepared for what was coming next. My revenge plan had 3 phases, each designed to escalate the pressure while giving Margaret multiple opportunities to surrender gracefully. Phase 1 was education. I prepared a detailed presentation about the actual property boundaries in Lakeside Estates and requested time on the agenda for the next HOA meeting. I wanted the entire community to understand how Margaret's restrictions had been based on incorrect assumptions about property ownership. The meeting was packed with residents who'd grown tired of Margaret's increasingly aggressive rule enforcement. When I began explaining the survey results, you could feel the tension in the room shift as people realized the implications of what I was revealing. I presented the evidence methodically, using maps and legal documents to show exactly which properties included water rights and which didn't. I explained how the original land development had been designed to provide shared pond access while maintaining individual property ownership, and how Margaret's exclusive access zones violated both the community covenants and individual property rights. The audience reaction was electric. Residents who'd been bullied into compliance with Margaret's arbitrary rules suddenly understood that she'd been operating without legal authority. Property owners who'd paid premium prices for waterfront access realized they might not own what they thought they'd purchased. And everyone could see that Margaret's attempts to consolidate control over community amenities had been based on false claims about property law. Margaret tried to control the damage by questioning my credentials and demanding independent verification of the survey results. But several residents had already started asking pointed questions about other boundary disputes and whether Margaret's interpretation of HOA authority might be flawed in other areas as well. I concluded my presentation by announcing that I would be exercising my full property rights going forward, including unrestricted access to my portion of Miller's Pond. I invited any residents with questions about property boundaries to consult with qualified professionals rather than relying on unofficial interpretations from HOA board members. Phase 2 was enforcement. I began using my pond property exactly as I pleased, fishing in areas that Margaret had declared off-limits and ignoring all of her previous restrictions. When she confronted me, I politely referred her to the survey documentation and suggested that she consult with a real estate attorney if she had concerns about property boundaries. I also started noticing and documenting all the ways that Margaret and other residents were using my property without permission. Her dock extended into my water rights area. Her landscaping included plants and decorative features installed on my land. Her regular morning walks crossed my property multiple times per week. After 2 weeks of careful documentation, I sent Margaret a formal notice requiring her to remove all unauthorized improvements from my property and cease trespassing on my land. The notice was professionally prepared by my attorney and included detailed legal descriptions of the violations along with a 30-day deadline for compliance. Margaret's response was to double down on her false claims and threaten legal action against me for harassment and interference with her property rights. She sent her own attorney's letter claiming that my property boundaries were incorrect and that established usage patterns gave her prescriptive rights to continued pond access. That was exactly what I'd hoped she would do. Margaret had just committed herself to a legal position that was demonstrably false and easily disproven. She'd also escalated our conflict to a level where I could justify using my most powerful weapons. Phase 3 was total victory. I filed a comprehensive lawsuit against Margaret, the HOA, and several other residents who'd been using my property without permission. The suit included claims for trespass, interference with property rights, harassment, and fraud. I demanded immediate injunctive relief to stop all unauthorized use of my land, plus monetary damages for the months of illegal restrictions I'd endured. But the real devastation came from the broader implications of the property boundary corrections. My attorney had researched the original land development thoroughly and discovered that the boundary errors affected nearly half the properties in Lakeside Estates. Multiple property owners who thought they had waterfront access actually owned landlocked parcels, while other residents had valuable water rights they'd never realized they possessed. The title insurance companies that had issued policies based on the incorrect boundary assumptions faced potential liability for millions of dollars in claims. Property values throughout the community would need to be reassessed based on actual rather than assumed water access. And the HOA itself faced potential dissolution since many of its fundamental assumptions about community property management had been legally invalid from the beginning. Margaret found herself at the center of a legal nightmare that extended far beyond our original fishing dispute. Property owners were demanding explanations for why they'd paid premium prices for waterfront access they didn't legally possess. The HOA's insurance carrier was investigating whether Margaret's unauthorized rule enforcement had created liability for the entire community. And several residents were exploring whether Margaret's real estate background had given her inside knowledge about the boundary problems that she'd failed to disclose when she bought her own property. The dominoes fell quickly once the legal pressure began building. Margaret's attorney advised her that her position was legally indefensible and that continuing to fight would only increase her potential liability. The HOA's insurance company refused to cover her personal legal expenses since she'd been acting outside her official authority. And the property owners who'd supported her exclusive access policies suddenly realized that their own water rights were at risk if the boundary corrections were applied consistently. Within 6 weeks of filing my lawsuit, Margaret requested a settlement conference. She arrived looking nothing like the confident authority figure who'd been terrorizing me for months. Her expensive business suits had been replaced by conservative dresses. Her commanding presence had shrunk into nervous deference, and her clipboard full of rules and restrictions had been replaced by a folder full of legal documents acknowledging her mistakes. The settlement negotiations were swift and comprehensive. Margaret agreed to pay all my legal expenses plus additional compensation for the months of harassment and interference with my property rights. She removed all unauthorized improvements from my land and signed easement agreements that clearly established my superior property rights to the disputed areas. More importantly, Margaret resigned from the HOA board and agreed to support a complete revision of the community rules to eliminate the arbitrary restrictions she'd imposed. The new HOA leadership implemented policies that respected actual property boundaries and gave all residents fair access to community amenities based on their legitimate rights rather than Margaret's personal preferences. The financial consequences for Margaret were severe but not devastating. The legal fees and settlement costs probably totaled around $50,000, plus the expense of removing and relocating her dock and landscaping features. But the social consequences were much more damaging to someone who'd built her identity around being the most powerful person in the community. Margaret became a pariah in Lakeside Estates. Residents who'd been intimidated by her aggressive leadership style felt betrayed when they learned how many of her rules had been legally baseless. Property owners who trusted her expertise about real estate law were furious that her mistakes had created confusion and potential liability for the entire community. And the new HOA board made it clear that her input on community matters was neither wanted nor welcome. 6 months after our settlement, Margaret put her house on the market. Without the exclusive waterfront access she'd claimed to own, her property was worth significantly less than she'd paid for it. The legal troubles had also damaged her reputation in the local real estate industry, making it difficult for her to continue her commercial development projects. I heard through the neighborhood gossip network that Margaret moved to a gated community in Florida, where her controversial history in Virginia wouldn't follow her. Apparently, she chose a place where the HOA rules were already established by professional management companies, so there wouldn't be any opportunities for her to recreate the problems she'd caused in Lakeside Estates. As for me, I got my fishing spot back, along with exclusive access to some of the best areas of Miller's Pond. But more importantly, I'd proven to myself that I didn't have to accept being bullied or intimidated by people who thought they could push me around. The skills I developed during my divorce and my professional career had given me the tools to fight back effectively when someone tried to take advantage of me. The revenge was deeply satisfying, but not in the way I'd expected. The real victory wasn't watching Margaret suffer consequences for her behavior, though that was certainly gratifying. The real victory was discovering that I had the strength and resources to protect what mattered to me and stand up for my rights when they were threatened. I still fish at Miller's Pond every morning, usually from the same spot where Margaret first confronted me about trespassing on her property. The water looks exactly the same as it did before our conflict began, but my relationship with it has changed. Now when I cast my line into those calm waters, I'm not just finding peace and solitude. I'm also enjoying the satisfaction of knowing that this beautiful place belongs to me, legally and completely. The new HOA leadership occasionally asks for my input on property management issues, recognizing that my legal background and research skills could help avoid future conflicts. I'm happy to help when needed, but I'm also careful to maintain the quiet, peaceful lifestyle that brought me to Lakeside Estates in the first place. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Margaret had approached our initial conflict with respect and a willingness to compromise instead of arrogance and intimidation. We probably could have worked out a reasonable sharing arrangement that would have given both of us access to the fishing areas we preferred. But Margaret's assumption that she could bully me into compliance led her to make choices that ultimately cost her everything she thought she'd gained by moving to our community. The lesson I learned from this experience is that bullies often defeat themselves if you give them enough rope. Margaret's overconfidence about her property rights and her refusal to consider that she might be wrong created the opening I needed to expose her mistakes and turn the tables completely. If she'd been more cautious about making legal claims she couldn't support, she might have maintained her position of authority indefinitely. But I'm grateful that she chose the path she did. Our conflict forced me to discover property rights I'd never known I possessed and gave me the opportunity to stand up for myself in a way that felt empowering rather than destructive. I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't planning elaborate punishments for people who wrong you. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let them get away with their bad behavior and holding them accountable for the consequences of their choices. What would you have done if someone tried to ban you from your favorite peaceful retreat based on false claims about property ownership? Would you have tried to compromise with Margaret, or would you have gone straight to the legal nuclear option? Drop a comment and let me know how you think this situation should have been handled, because I have plenty more stories about neighborhood conflicts that got completely out of control when reasonable people stopped being reasonable.